The moment I saw Karen's luxury SUV parked fully inside my locked workshop, with the engine off and not a soul around, I honestly thought I was having a heatstroke. My tools were scattered, my latest build was blocked in, and on the front windshield was a sticky note that simply said, "I needed shade. Thanks." That's it. No apology. No number. Not even her name. Just that smug, entitled scribble that somehow managed to turn my $300,000 restoration project into her personal sun shelter. I didn't scream. I didn't call the cops. I picked up my welder, sealed every door shut like a vault, and booked myself a vacation out of state. And oh yeah, I left the cameras rolling. 2 weeks before this madness, life was good. I was finally ahead on my orders, my clients were happy, and I'd just installed a hydraulic lift that made restoring classic muscle cars an absolute joy. My workshop wasn't just a place of work. It was my peace, my pride, and honestly, the only reason I could stand living under the iron rule of an HOA that had more drama than a reality show reunion. But I figured as long as I kept my nose down and didn't paint anything neon or leave tools on the lawn, I'd stay off their radar. That illusion shattered the day Karen moved into the corner lot down the hill. She arrived in a white Escalade, blasting opera music with the windows down and yelling at the movers for stacking her yoga mats vertically instead of horizontally. Within 48 hours, she had introduced herself via a laminated pamphlet titled Karen's Guide to a Better Neighborhood, which included her made-up role, HOA Liaison of Parking and Aesthetic. I thought it was a joke. It wasn't. A week later, I caught her measuring the length of my driveway with a tape measure. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Just checking to see if you're still within the community's visual harmony guidelines." I blinked twice and walked away. It started small. She sent a complaint to the HOA board about my oversized mailbox. Then one about the unsubtle garage paint tone. Then she claimed my clients driving in for consultations congested the peace. Most were laughed off by the other board members, who found her annoying but harmless. But harmless turned hostile fast. One morning, I came out with coffee in hand to find her SUV halfway across my gravel path, tires kicked up like she'd done donuts at 3 a.m. She had the nerve to wave from her front lawn and shout, "Sorry, temporary parking." I chalked it up to a one-off. Maybe she had guessed. Maybe she was confused. I left a handwritten note on her windshield, short, polite, and direct. "Please don't park on my shop entrance again. This area is under video monitoring. Thank you." The next morning, my note was gone, and so was her car. But in its place was a set of fresh tire marks leading all the way up to the edge of my hydraulic ramp. I checked the cameras. She had driven up at midnight, stood in front of the shop for a full minute, looked directly into the camera, and flipped it off. No subtlety. No confusion. Just entitlement with headlights. That's when I contacted the HOA board directly. I sent the footage. I explained the safety concerns, especially considering I often used flammable materials, sharp tools, and heavy equipment. But the response was diplomatic at best. "We'll look into it," said Mr. Lewis, the HOA president, a man who spent more time worrying about fence heights than actual human behavior. I asked if they'd at least issue a notice or talk to her. He muttered something about not wanting to escalate neighbor tensions and needing a formal complaint trail. Translation: "You're on your own." So I called the local PD. Officer Grant, who'd responded to one of my false noise complaints a month prior, showed up again. He watched the footage and raised an eyebrow. "You say she parked inside your workshop?" I nodded. "And she's not authorized? No lease agreement, nothing?" I shook my head again. "All right, sounds like trespassing." But then Karen came marching up the street in her designer sandals and immediately turned on the waterworks. "He locked my car in. I thought it was a community facility. He threatened to burn it down." I stood there in greasy coveralls, holding a coffee cup, blinking in disbelief. The officer sighed. Look, I can't arrest her unless there's damage or a restraining order violation. Civil matter for now. File a report and document everything." And with that, he left. Karen gave me a smug little smile and sashayed off like she'd just won a pageant. I stood there wondering how someone could lie so confidently while knowing they were caught on camera doing the exact opposite. Days passed, and the situation escalated. Karen began parking directly in front of the workshop every other day. Once, she even backed her SUV halfway into the shop while I was inside working on a '67 Camaro. When I asked what the hell she was doing, she smiled and said, "Just checking for safety hazards." Then she got into her SUV, drove off, and left behind a cloud of entitlement and cheap perfume. That's when I decided to get creative. I ordered motion-triggered alarms. I repositioned cameras. I even installed reinforced brackets around the doors. But none of it worked, not when the HOA refused to act and the police kept kicking it back as a civil nuisance. Karen had found the loophole and was exploiting it with Olympic-level dedication. Until the day she took it one step too far. It was a Friday. I had stepped out for 20 minutes to grab lunch. When I returned, the workshop was shut, locked, but eerily quiet. I opened the access gate and saw it, the Escalade. Not just in front of the workshop, not partially on the drive, but inside. Fully parked between my workbench and lift like it belonged there. No note. No Karen. No contact. I stood there, jaw slack, watching as my stress levels caught fire. I called her. Straight to voicemail. I knocked on her door. No answer. I texted, "Your car is inside my workshop. This is trespassing. Move it or I'm calling a tow." She replied 3 hours later with, "Oops. Was in a rush. I'll swing by later. Don't touch my vehicle." That was the last straw. I didn't scream. I didn't yell. I didn't call anyone. I grabbed my welding gloves, fired up the machine, and sealed every workshop door shut with a thick line of molten steel. 6 points across 3 doors. Reinforced and secure. I made sure the cameras caught it all. Then I packed my bag, booked a flight to Colorado, and sent one final message to Karen. "Don't worry. Your car will be safe. The building's locked up tighter than Fort Knox." And with that, I went on vacation, knowing full well that I had just turned her Escalade into the most expensive storage unit in town. By the time my flight landed in Denver, I had already received 6 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and a barrage of texts, all from one unamused, absolutely unhinged Karen. The tone started civil, just barely. Her first message read, "Hi, I notice the doors seem stuck. Can you unlock them, please?" 20 minutes later, she followed up with, "This isn't funny." Then, like flipping a switch, her tone turned hostile and shrill. "This is illegal imprisonment. You can't trap someone's car like this." I scrolled through each ridiculous message while waiting for my brother to pick me up, each one getting more frantic than the last. But I had already put my phone on silent and enabled all security feed backups to the cloud. Whatever Karen thought she could pull now, it was too late. Back home, the show had just begun. According to my neighbor Frank, who lived directly across the street and was only too happy to keep me informed, Karen spent the first few hours pacing in front of the shop like a lioness who realized her den was welded shut. She called the police almost immediately, playing her favorite role, the innocent victim. But this time, it didn't land the way she expected. When the officers arrived and she whined about being locked out of her own SUV, they quickly found themselves confused. One peek at the security feed from my front-facing camera revealed what they needed to know. Karen had entered my private workshop without permission and parked inside it. I hadn't moved her car or tampered with it in any way. I simply secured my building while she happened to be inside it. The officers, as Frank told me while chuckling over the phone, shrugged and told her, "Ma'am, it sounds like a civil dispute. You might need to call a locksmith." Karen's next genius move was exactly that. She tried to bring in a locksmith, But the man took one look at the welded steel seams and said he wasn't touching that mess. Liability, he muttered. Karen lost it. She demanded he cut through it, even offered him cash on the spot. When he refused, she threw a tantrum so loud Frank could hear it from his porch. She yelled into her phone about needing to get the fire department involved, and even tried to get animal control to investigate, a strange chemical smell coming from inside. Of course, there was nothing of the sort, just the rich scent of metal, grease, and karma marinating under a sealed roof. The HOA caught wind of the situation on the second day. Mr. Lewis, ever the reluctant leader, left me a message that tried desperately to stay neutral. He said, "Ray, I hope you're doing well. There's been some concern raised about access to the workshop. I think it would be best to resolve this peacefully." I didn't bother replying. Instead, I posted a note to the community board with one line: "My private workshop is locked and monitored for security purposes. Any unauthorized vehicles are being documented." That post got more likes than anything I'd ever put up. Neighbors were watching this whole fiasco unfold like a reality show in real time. On day 3, Karen escalated again. She showed up with a news van. Yep. Channel 8 local news parked on the edge of the cul-de-sac, and out came a reporter and cameraman. Karen stood dramatically in front of the workshop, arms crossed, acting like she was a whistleblower revealing some dark neighborhood conspiracy. The segment aired that night under the ridiculous headline, "Local Woman's Car Held Hostage by Neighbor." But to her horror, the camera crew had also interviewed Frank, who calmly explained to the reporter that Karen had illegally entered someone's private property, parked her SUV inside their workspace, and was now trying to play the victim after being caught. The station aired both sides. Comments online quickly turned against Karen. The true kicker came on day 4, when an anonymous email was sent to the HOA board. It contained scanned documents showing Karen's SUV registration was expired and her license was currently suspended due to a pending hit-and-run case in a neighboring county. The documents were verified, and suddenly the same woman demanding justice was now exposed as someone who shouldn't have been driving at all. Once again, the pieces began falling into place, and Karen was on the wrong end of every one of them. Meanwhile, I was having the most peaceful vacation I'd had in years. My brother and I went hiking in the Rockies, grilled steaks, played pool in his garage, and watched reruns of old action flicks. Every night, I'd check the security feed just to see what flavor of Meltdown Karen was serving that day. One night she arrived with bolt cutters and 2 large men who looked like they'd been hired off a Craigslist ad. They approached the shop, eyed the welded seams, and one of them audibly said, "Nope. I'm not risking a lawsuit." Karen shouted something about cowards as they got back into their truck and drove away. On the 6th day, she tried something new. She posted on the community forum a long, poorly punctuated rant accusing me of theft, vandalism, harassment, and psychological sabotage. She demanded immediate HOA action and even suggested I be banned from operating a business in the neighborhood. But what she didn't realize was how many people she had alienated. Within minutes, the replies rolled in. One neighbor wrote, "You mean the workshop you weren't invited into?" Another added, "Lady, you've complained about everyone's pets, lawns, and decorations. Maybe sit this one out." The post was locked by the board within an hour. Karen's digital tantrum had only dug her hole deeper. On the 7th day, I finally decided to message her. Just one simple text: "Hope your car's doing okay. Workshop still secure. Be back soon." No threats. No insults. Just a reminder that I was watching and, more importantly, not worried in the slightest. She didn't reply. Instead, she tried sneaking in a complaint to code enforcement. She claimed I was operating an illegal commercial structure and that toxic welding fumes were a danger to the community. Unfortunately for her, my permits were in perfect order, and the inspector who showed up? He was the same guy who had approved my building extension 2 years earlier. He took one look, gave a thumbs up to Frank, and left. By the end of the week, It was clear that Karen was unraveling. Her SUV, now sitting untouched for 8 days inside a sealed garage, was becoming a symbol of her entitlement and helplessness. She started avoiding neighbors. Her once daily power walks stopped. Her porch lights stayed off. Some said they saw her crying one night in her backyard, pacing and muttering to herself. Part of me felt a sliver of sympathy. But then I remembered the months of her games, the disrespect, the false complaints, and the way she used rules as weapons. No. This wasn't cruelty. This was karma. I flew back on Sunday evening, feeling lighter than I had in months. My phone was still pinging with missed voicemails from Karen, but I ignored them. My Uber dropped me off at the corner, and I took a slow walk toward my house, breathing in the cool dusk air. Everything looked peaceful, serene, untouched. Except, of course, for the now infamous white SUV still sitting inside my shop like an expensive paperweight. I stood in front of the steel doors, ran my fingers along the weld seams, and smiled. It was time for the grand unsealing. But not yet. Not before I made one final phone call. I reached out to the local authorities, shared all the documentation I had collected over the past 10 days, and invited them to witness the removal. Because when I cut those welds, I wanted Karen to be present, and I wanted someone with a badge standing by for what was sure to come next. The morning of the great unsealing arrived with the kind of stillness that only comes before a storm. I brewed a cup of coffee, checked my camera feeds, and confirmed what I already suspected. Karen had camped out across the street since sunrise, practically twitching with anticipation. She paced, squatted, stood, then paced again. She wasn't even trying to hide the fact that she was waiting for me. Her eyes locked on mine the moment I stepped out onto the porch. I gave her a casual wave, sipping my coffee like I was about to enjoy a leisurely morning, not prepared to unleash months of frustration through one final satisfying act of justice. I didn't walk straight to the workshop. No, I took my time, stretched, talked to Frank, who was outside trimming hedges, pretending he wasn't just here for the show. He smirked and gave me a thumbs up. "You ready for this?" he asked. "Been ready since the minute she blocked my entire driveway to inspect my bushes," I replied. Then, with slow deliberate steps, I walked to the shop, pulling out my phone to confirm that Officer Grant was en route, just as we'd discussed. The police wanted to be present, not just to keep the peace, but because Karen had tried filing a report accusing me of grand theft auto. Of course, she left out the part where she illegally parked her own vehicle inside my private building. Officer Grant arrived right on time, pulling up just as Karen made her move. She stormed across the street with a manila folder in hand and fury in her eyes. "That's my vehicle," she announced to the officer, pointing like she was identifying a stolen artifact. "He's been holding it hostage. He welded it in there. That's illegal confinement. I have my documents. I have everything. I want it released right now." Grant looked at her, then at me, then back to her. "Ma'am, we've reviewed the footage. You entered private property without permission. The vehicle was not taken, it was never moved. You parked it inside a building that doesn't belong to you." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But it's just a garage. He left with my car locked inside. That's kidnapping. Or theft. Or both." The officer held up a hand. "It's none of those. It's a civil matter. And if you want to get your car out, I suggest you let him open the building without interference." That shut her up, at least temporarily. I walked up to the steel doors, coffee still in one hand, and pulled out my angle grinder. The welds had held beautifully, not even a speck of rust despite the week-long exposure. I fired up the tool, sparks flying in short bursts as I carefully cut each seam one by one. The grinding echoed through the neighborhood, and with every metallic screech, Karen's face contorted a little more. By the time the last weld snapped and I heaved the doors open, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The SUV sat there, looking pristine but utterly defeated. Dust coated the windshield, and a sticky note was taped directly in the center. It read, Next time, call a cab. I hadn't put it there. Frank later confessed he did, which made the whole moment even better. Karen rushed forward but was stopped short by Officer Grant. "Ma'am, before you touch the vehicle, I have to inform you of a few things," he said. "1. Your registration is expired. 2. Your license has been suspended. You are not allowed to drive this vehicle." Karen froze, her hand halfway to the driver's side door. "That's not true," she hissed. "I fixed it. I paid it. It's all a mistake." Grant pulled out a small tablet and tapped through a few screens. "As of this morning, the system still shows suspension active and registration unpaid. I'm going to have to ask you not to operate this vehicle." She looked like she might explode. Her entire face turned a shade of red I didn't think was humanly possible. "So what now?" she demanded. "Do I just leave it here?" I stepped in. "You'll need to have it towed. Or pushed. But you're not driving it out of here. Not unless you want another fine, or worse." That was the moment she snapped. Not a screaming, violent outburst like some expected. No, this was worse. She went quiet. Dead quiet. Turned around, walked away, and sat down on the curb across the street. It was like watching someone's power supply get unplugged. The HOA board held a meeting that evening, and to everyone's surprise, it wasn't closed door. Word spread fast, and the community room was packed. Karen showed up with a binder full of evidence she believed would vindicate her. Instead, she was greeted with a lineup of her neighbors ready to testify about months, some even claimed years, of harassment, fake violations, and property meddling. One man shared how Karen reported his child's lemonade stand for unauthorized commercial activity. A woman showed pictures of Karen trimming her roses because they didn't fit the community aesthetic. Another brought emails where Karen threatened legal action over a decorative mailbox. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I played the video. The one where she backed into my shop, stepped out, looked around, and walked off like she owned the place. The footage was clear, uncut, undeniable. Silence fell over the room. Karen didn't even attempt to refute it. The board voted unanimously to strip her of her self-appointed liaison role, issue her a formal violation notice, and fine her for interference with private property and community reputation damage. Karen didn't take it well. She stormed out before the meeting ended, knocking over a display table with HOA brochures on her way out. A few days later, she was back to pacing her porch and avoiding eye contact with anyone who walked by. Her SUV was towed out by a professional service she hired under a fake name, but the cameras still caught her directing them, face flushed, hands waving wildly as she shouted orders like a disrespected general. I figured that would be the end of it, but then came the most unexpected twist. A week after the meeting, I received a formal notice from the city about a noise complaint, filed anonymously, claiming unlicensed industrial activity. I laughed when I saw it. Karen hadn't learned a thing. But I didn't panic. I simply forwarded my license, permit, and the inspection results from earlier in the year to the city clerk. They responded within 24 hours with a formal dismissal of the complaint and a note that read, "Your compliance is fully verified. Sorry for the inconvenience." I printed that email, framed it, and hung it above my workstation. Karen's grasp on the neighborhood slipped faster than anyone expected. People stopped waving at her. Parents stopped letting their kids near her lawn. One neighbor removed the hedges that divided their yards, saying she didn't want anything shared with Karen's property. Her power had never been real, it was just fear and noise. And now, the noise was gone. I hosted a community cookout the next weekend, not out of spite, but out of joy. Almost every neighbor showed up. Burgers sizzled, kids ran around with water balloons, and music played from an old jukebox I had restored last fall. Everyone took turns telling their favorite Karen story, and by the end of the night, someone had started referring to my garage as the vault. I didn't argue. In fact, I painted the name above the doors the next morning. As for Karen, she watched the whole thing from her front window, curtains drawn just enough to peek through. Her kingdom had crumbled, and in its place, a community finally felt free to breathe. I had welded her. The days that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced in that neighborhood. The people who once kept to themselves were suddenly friendlier. Strangers waved when they passed by my driveway. Families I had only seen through windows now strolled past with their kids, nodding or stopping to compliment my work. It was like someone had opened a valve and let all the pressure escape from a tightly wound community. And in many ways, someone had. Karen had ruled through intimidation, complaints, and self-inflated authority for far too long. Now that the curtain had been pulled back, she was just a bitter neighbor with a loud voice and no real power. And I had become, unintentionally, the guy who finally stood up to her and lived to tell the tale. Business picked up almost overnight. I had new inquiries coming in daily, some from within the neighborhood, others from nearby towns who had seen the viral news clip or heard the story through someone who knew someone. A few folks wanted custom work done just because they liked the way I handled the situation. One client said, "If you can weld a garage shut to trap a Karen, you can definitely restore a '69 GTO." I took it as the highest compliment. I hired a second pair of hands, a young apprentice named Liam who lived 2 blocks over and had been looking for mentorship. He had once been reported by Karen for playing drums too loudly at 3 p.m. on a Saturday. That was enough of a bond for us to get along instantly. But just because Karen had been knocked off her imaginary throne didn't mean she was done scheming. She didn't yell at people anymore. She didn't walk the neighborhood or bark orders from her porch. No, now she operated from the shadows. Her new tactic was paperwork. Petty, drawn-out, anonymous complaints to every agency she could think of. In the span of a week, I received notifications from the zoning office, the health department, the building inspector, and even the fire marshal. Each letter was worded like a routine checkup, citing reports of excessive noise, unauthorized material storage, improper signage, and even possible toxic fumes. I couldn't help but laugh. She had gone full paperwork warfare. But what Karen failed to understand was that I'd spent years building my business by the book. Every inch of my shop was up to code. My ventilation system was certified. My signage had HOA approval from years ago. And my material storage was documented, labeled, and safely stashed in designated fireproof lockers. It took me an entire day to compile everything, but I did. I put together a single email that included scanned permits, inspection sign-offs, annotated photos, and a signed letter from the city inspector who had visited just 3 months earlier. Within 72 hours, every complaint was dismissed. Not only that, but the city officially logged the complaints as unfounded and documented the anonymous reporter as a potential source of harassment. Karen's silence after that was palpable. I could practically feel her seething behind her curtains, watching the community thrive while her carefully constructed empire of fear turned to dust. She tried one last desperate move, a civil claim. A few weeks later, I received a summons from the county courthouse. Karen had filed a small claims case against me, alleging emotional distress, damage to property, and reputational harm. The list of accusations read like the fever dream of a gossip columnist. She claimed I welded her SUV in to ruin her standing in the neighborhood, that I had orchestrated a social media campaign against her, and that I had endangered her health by locking her vehicle in a metal tomb during high humidity. I almost didn't want to respond. It was so ridiculous, but I knew better than to ignore legal matters, no matter how absurd. I gathered all my footage again, including clips of her entering the shop on her own, my messages asking her to remove the vehicle, and the timeline of everything that happened from the first parking violation to the final removal. I even included her online rants, the HOA meeting notes, and testimonials from neighbors. When court day came, I walked in calm, confident, and unshaken. Karen, however, showed up with a wheeled crate full of what looked like scribbled complaints, printed emails, and screenshots of online forums taken wildly out of context. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and no patience for theatrics, listened quietly as Karen attempted to tell her story. She described herself as a concerned citizen, a victim of bullying, and an advocate for neighborhood order. The judge raised one eyebrow and asked a single question: "Did you have permission to park your vehicle in the plaintiff's private workshop?" Karen stuttered, then muttered, "It wasn't locked." The judge sighed, turned to me, and asked for my evidence. I submitted everything neatly in a binder, already organized by date. 10 minutes later, the case was dismissed. Karen was warned about abusing the court system, and I was awarded a judgment for legal fees totaling just under $1,000. I didn't cash the check when it arrived. I framed it and hung it right below the email from the city inspector. A little victory wall, built not from spite but from persistence. I had never gone looking for this battle, but since it found me, I had made sure to finish it properly. And yet, Karen wasn't quite finished with herself. That's the funny thing about people like her. They don't need opponents to lose, they just need an audience that stops applauding. The community made it clear that the applause was gone. Neighbors stopped replying to her emails. Her invitations to HOA events were quietly ignored. Even her walking group. Yes, she had formed one to monitor lawn heights and sidewalk cleanliness, disbanded without a word. One neighbor removed the bush line that divided their properties, not to merge yards but to install a security camera aimed squarely at Karen's driveway. Another repainted their home with a bright mural titled "Freedom from HOA Tyranny," a colorful, passive-aggressive dig that made local headlines. No one asked them to remove it. And then came the biggest surprise. A month after the lawsuit debacle, I received a knock on my door from none other than Mr. Lewis, the HOA president himself. He looked tired, worn down by years of tension and bureaucracy. "Ray," he said, "we've had a vote, and the board wants to offer you something. We'd like you to join the HOA council. Officially. As a member who brings common sense." I nearly dropped my coffee. Me? On the HOA board? The very same group that had ignored every warning I'd given about Karen? It was tempting. It was justice. But I declined. I told him I'd rather help from the outside. Fix cars. Weld things. Maybe teach neighborhood kids how to change oil or run diagnostics. And if the HOA ever needed help with something real, I'd be there. I didn't need a title. I already had what I wanted. My shop. My peace. And a neighborhood that finally learned how to breathe again. Karen, now stripped of influence and drowning in her own bitterness, stayed mostly indoors. Her property looked the same, but it felt abandoned, cold, lifeless. Every once in a while, I'd see her watering her bushes with the same robotic motions she once used to fill out violation notices. No one bothered her. No one confronted her. There was no need. One afternoon, as I was tuning the engine of a restored '68 Mustang, Liam walked into the shop holding a large poster board. It was the community kids, thanking me for fixing their bikes, helping with their go-karts, and teaching them basic car maintenance. In the center of the board was a cartoon drawing of my workshop, with bold letters scrawled above the roof. It read, "The Vault, where Karen got welded." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. I taped the poster next to my other trophies of triumph. And for the first time since Karen parked her SUV in my shop uninvited, I realized something important. It was never just about the car or the workshop or even the welding. It was about setting boundaries, about proving that respect goes both ways. And in this small corner of the world, with a torch in one hand and a whole lot of patience in the other, I'd finally earned mine. It had been 2 months since the last real Karen incident, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood had found its rhythm. People mowed their lawns without worrying about tape measures. Kids rode bikes without being photographed for so-called community violations. The HOA board operated like a normal committee instead of a neighborhood surveillance squad, and the air just felt lighter. My shop, once a quiet corner of personal retreat, had turned into something much more, part workshop, part gathering place, and part symbol of resilience. I never set out to become that guy, the one who stood up and changed things, but now that I had, I wasn't going to shy away from it. Karen, meanwhile, had all but disappeared. She was still in her house, still lurking behind curtains, still watering her bushes with robotic stiffness. But the fire in her eyes, that delusional sparkle of authority, was gone. Occasionally she ventured out to pick up a package or drag her garbage bins to the curb, but she kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. No more laminated warnings. No more flyers. Not even passive-aggressive mutterings. It was like watching a storm cloud shrink into a puddle. The funny part was, nobody really wanted her to leave. They just wanted her to stop trying to rule everything like a suburban dictator. Then one morning, something unusual happened. A moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. Not one of those exploratory rental vans people use when they're considering a garage sale, but a full-sized, professional-grade moving truck. Two men stepped out, began hauling boxes, and didn't even knock on the door. They went straight to the garage, opened it, and started loading. Word traveled fast. Within an hour, people were peeking from blinds and texting one another. Was she really leaving? Had she sold the house? Did someone finally file a countersuit big enough to push her out? I got my answer later that afternoon when the HOA board sent out a group message to all residents. As of this week, Karen Williams has sold her property and will be relocating. We thank her for her time in the community and wish her well. That was it. No ceremony. No parting speech. No farewell cupcakes or photo collages. She was just gone. The SUV was already parked inside the truck, strapped down tightly as if even the movers didn't trust it to behave. By sundown, the only sign she had ever lived there was the bare dirt patch where her lawn ornament army once stood like HOA soldiers enforcing imaginary rules. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't post, didn't gloat, didn't even wave as the truck pulled away. I just stood in front of my workshop, arms crossed, watching the last chapter of chaos roll out of the neighborhood with zero fanfare. And for some reason, that felt even better than revenge. This wasn't about rubbing it in, it was about closure. She had made her decisions. She had tried to dominate and intimidate and manipulate. But in the end, she had folded under the weight of her own nonsense. There was something beautifully poetic about that. Later that week, I hosted another barbecue. This time it wasn't just neighbors, it was everyone. Former targets of Karen's wrath, local police who had dealt with her, HOA members, even a few clients who had become friends over the years. We grilled ribs, passed around cold drinks, and laughed about everything from Karen's emotional support SUV to the time she tried to file a noise complaint over a child's birthday kazoo. No one was cruel about it. The laughter wasn't sharp or bitter. It was healing, the kind of communal joy that only comes after enduring a long, shared irritation. The stress was gone, and the sound of music and kids playing had replaced it. One of the most surprising guests at that barbecue was Mr. Lewis, the HOA president. He approached me with a plate of brisket in one hand and a bottle of local beer in the other. "You know," he said, "I think that was the first time our HOA actually came together for something good." I raised my drink and nodded. All it took was one SUV, a welder, and a locked door. He laughed. "You ever think about running for president of the board?" I nearly choked on my drink. Hard pass. I like my job too much. And besides, I'd weld the entire clubhouse shut the first time someone complained about hedge symmetry. He grinned and said, "That's exactly why people would vote for you." In the weeks that followed, things just kept getting better. The mural that had started as a joke, a cartoonish rendering of Karen's SUV welded inside a garage with the words "The Vault" stenciled underneath, was turned into a proper piece of art by a local painter. She added rays of light shining out the door, neighborhood kids peeking in curiously, and even a small flaming torch in the corner as a tribute to my welder. People loved it. Even the city's arts committee visited and deemed it culturally significant, which made everyone laugh but also ensured it couldn't be removed. With Karen gone, the HOA went through a minor transformation. Rules were still enforced, but sensibly. Nobody cared about garden gnome sizes or the number of flower pots on porches anymore. The board started asking for community input before making changes. People felt heard. And as for me, I finally got to do what I loved without the constant threat of being ticketed for existing. My workshop flourished. I took on bigger projects, mentored more young mechanics, and even started filming a few YouTube videos teaching basic car repair. The first video? How to safely weld a steel seam without burning your garage down. It went mildly viral. Then came one last twist. I was sitting in the shop one late afternoon, sipping coffee and polishing the fender of a vintage truck, when Liam came running and holding a brown envelope. "This just came in the mail," he said. "No return address." I opened it cautiously, half expecting another Karen surprise. Inside was a single piece of paper. Typed. No signature. It read, "You think you won, but I'll see you again. Don't get comfortable." Liam leaned over and read it aloud, then burst into laughter. "She really mailed you a threat letter with no name on it? Like a movie villain?" I folded it and tossed it into the shredder. Let her watch from the shadows. Just gives me more views.